In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where justice was brutal and spectacle was law, there existed a punishment so ghastly, so horrifying, that it blurred the line between punishment and perverse entertainment. It was known as the Coffin Torture, a punishment where the condemned were not merely executed, but slowly, publicly decomposed alive inside iron cages shaped like human coffins. These were not hidden in dungeons. They were hung high, on city gates, in town squares, along well-traveled roads, for all to see. Children, elders, nobles, and peasants alike would walk past these grotesque cages and watch the slow, relentless decay of a living human soul. Victims were forced into these narrow iron frames, too tight to sit, too low to stand, where birds picked flesh, insects nested in open wounds, and the sun baked skin until it split. For days, sometimes weeks, they screamed, then moaned, then whispered, and then silence. But the body stayed, rotting, leaking, falling apart, piece by piece, in full view of society. Why was this allowed? Who decided this was justice? And what kinds of people suffered such a fate? Let's begin the descent into one of history's most forgotten, but most disturbing punishments. Throughout history, civilizations have designed punishments not just to deter, but to terrify. In medieval Europe, justice was performance art. It had to be seen, heard, and remembered. And the coffin torture? It was one of the most vividly unforgettable forms of punishment ever conceived. The coffin torture, sometimes referred to as the gibbet or iron cage, wasn't just a method of execution. It was a slow-motion descent into madness and death, inflicted with surgical cruelty. Victims were forced into a cage shaped roughly like a human body, made of thick iron bars. Once locked inside, there was no comfort, no rest. The cage didn't accommodate the body, it restricted it. The neck was held in place. The arms and legs splayed unnaturally. The prisoner was neither standing nor hanging, just suspended in agony. These cages were often displayed in public, sometimes hanging from gallows, trees, or towers. The idea was simple. The more people saw it, the more they feared crossing the law. The condemned wasn't just punished, they were exhibited, like some grotesque warning sign. But it wasn't the iron that killed them. It was time. Time for their muscles to atrophy, for their joints to swell, for their blood to slow and clot, for insects to crawl into open sores, for the skin to blister under the sun, or, in colder regions, for frostbite to chew their flesh until the bone turned black. Death came eventually, but it never came fast. And even when it did, their body remained on display. That was part of the design. The rotting corpse inside the iron coffin wasn't removed. It was allowed to decay, to become a husk, bones wrapped in dried skin, until it finally disintegrated. All the while, townsfolk would pass by, children would gawk, vendors would set up stalls nearby. Life went on around the dead who never left. In some parts of Europe, these cages remained for years, a permanent part of the landscape. A silent reminder of what happened to traitors, thieves, heretics, and rebels. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to erase the person's dignity, their humanity, their very existence, in slow motion. But who were the ones sentenced to this fate? Were they monsters, murderers, or something else entirely? In the next chapter, we uncover the kinds of crimes that earned such a hellish fate, and why the definition of justice was often just a reflection of power. Not everyone who found themselves locked inside a coffin cage was a murderer. In fact, many weren't even violent. What made the coffin torture so chilling wasn't just the method, but how broadly and arbitrarily it was applied. It revealed a justice system that was more about fear than fairness, more about control than compassion. Throughout the 12th to 18th centuries, the iron coffin became a tool of spectacle and suppression, especially in regions of Germany, France, and England. But the punishment wasn't always reserved for those who committed heinous crimes. It was used for those who dared to challenge authority, whether religious, political, or societal. Consider this. A baker who used fraudulent weights, selling customers short on bread, could be sentenced to the coffin. A woman accused of witchcraft, often without proof beyond superstition, might find herself wasting away in steel. Thieves, no matter how small the theft, were frequently deemed worthy of the cage. And political dissenters? They were among the most common victims. One of the most infamous examples comes from 16th century Germany. A man named Hans Schmidt, a vocal critic of the ruling bishopric, was accused of sedition, though no concrete proof ever surfaced. Still, the bishop ordered his punishment to be public, brutal, and unforgettable. Hans was placed in a cage near the town gate, where travelers from every corner would see his suffering. Over 4 days, he screamed, cursed, begged. By the 5th, his voice was gone. By the 6th, his skin had begun to peel in the sun. And by the 7th, he was dead. But his body remained there for nearly 3 years, a twisted monument to obedience. In England, during the height of anti-poaching laws in the 17th century, several men were gibbeted simply for killing deer on noble land. The message was clear. Landowners ruled not only the earth, but the lives of those beneath them. To defy that meant becoming a feast for crows. In some towns, the iron coffin became a kind of folk warning. It stood outside the courthouse or town square, not because someone had recently died there, but because someone had long ago. It was left behind, like a ritual to remind people that this is what happens when you forget your place. There were even reports of innocent people, accused falsely by rivals or enemies, being condemned without proper trial. Once inside the cage, truth no longer mattered. Guilt was irrelevant. The sentence was final, and the slow death ahead was guaranteed. Perhaps the most disturbing element of this history is not how rare or extreme these cases were, but how ordinary. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of the legal fabric, and they were endorsed by the church, by monarchs, by community leaders who believed that a justice system must rule by fear first. But if the crimes were often trivial or fabricated, and the punishments so grotesque, one has to wonder, who were the people carrying out these sentences? Who forged the cages? Who locked the doors? And did they sleep well at night? In the next part, we meet the blacksmiths, guards, and executioners who helped turn justice into a public theater of cruelty, and what it did to their souls. It's easy to focus on the victims of the coffin torture, and they deserve remembrance. But to truly grasp the horror of this punishment, we must confront an even more unsettling truth. Someone had to build the cage. Someone had to lock it. Someone had to watch. These weren't nameless figures in the shadows. They were blacksmiths, jailers, and guards, ordinary tradesmen, men of the town, fathers, brothers, husbands. And yet, their hands helped engineer slow death, piece by piece. In medieval society, blacksmiths were essential, highly skilled artisans, often respected. But when the church or crown called for a coffin cage, the job was clear. The commission came with detailed specifications: width of the bars, length of the limbs, placement of iron bands around the chest, hips, and throat. Some cages were designed for maximum exposure, with wide gaps to allow animals easy access. Others were crafted to contort, squeezing the body unnaturally, breaking bones over time, not with force, but with the pressure of hours and gravity. Blacksmiths didn't ask questions. Their job was to obey. Refusal could mean suspicion. And in this era, suspicion could mean the cage itself. Then there were the executioners and guards, the ones tasked with fastening the iron doors, hoisting the cage into place, and ensuring the prisoner was visible, suffering, and unable to escape. Their role didn't end after the lock clicked. They monitored the victim, sometimes for days or weeks, ensuring no food or water reached them. Some were even ordered to poke the dying with spears to ensure they were still alive for longer. Why? Because justice had to be seen and heard. Imagine waking each morning and climbing the gallows to check if the man inside the cage was still breathing. Imagine watching him rot, day by day, his skin cracking, eyes bulging, mucus and blood dripping between the bars. The stench unbearable, the silence worse. Some guards became numb. They joked, drank, and bet on how long each victim would last. Others began to spiral. Records from 14th century Paris tell of a guard who slit his own throat after a month of watching a prisoner rot in front of his post. His final words, his eyes would not close. But not all who carried out the torture were broken by it. Some took pleasure in the ritual. Inquisitors, in particular, saw it as a holy task. To them, each scream was proof of the soul being purged, each blister a sign of divine judgment. The more painful the death, the more complete the punishment. These were true believers, who saw mercy as a betrayal of God. And then there were the crowds. Because the cage wasn't locked in private, it was placed in marketplaces, at festival entrances, and along main roads. The suffering man or woman became part of the scenery, a living billboard of state power. Children laughed. Vendors made money. Priests offered prayers. Society moved on, while a human being decomposed in public view. The horror was never just the metal. It was the normalization. The way entire towns grew used to the rot. But what happened when these cages stopped serving their original purpose? What did cities do with them once the bodies fell apart and the justice faded? In the next part, we explore how abandoned cages haunted towns for decades, becoming relics of horror, symbols of forgotten victims, and sometimes the cause of terrifying legends. When the screaming stopped and the flesh fell away, what remained wasn't just bones. It was a symbol. A twisted, rusted shell of justice, vengeance, or something far more sinister. Because the coffin torture didn't end with death. In many cases, that's when the story truly began. All across Europe, iron cages hung long after their occupants had rotted into dust. Towns rarely removed them quickly. There was no ceremony, no burial, no final rites. The body disintegrated, picked clean by weather, birds, and time, while the cage remained, swinging in the wind like a forgotten wind chime of death. In some places, the cages were left intentionally. They became permanent fixtures, not just as deterrents, but as warnings, as if the mere presence of the rusted iron could repel sin. Travelers spoke of passing under hanging skeletons, their teeth still visible, their hair clinging to scalp fragments. Superstition grew, because where death lingers, legends grow. In England, near the Yorkshire moors, locals told tales of a cage that had held a murderer named Reeve Colton. For years after his death, villagers claimed to hear a metal creak at midnight, even when the wind was still. A foul stench hung in the air around the cage post, despite no corpse being present. Animals refused to go near it, and when one local blacksmith tried to cut it down, his house burned to the ground that same night. The town of Lauterbach, Germany, once hosted a cage on the church's east tower. Over time, its occupant, long dead, became the subject of children's rhymes. Locals whispered that his eyes glowed red on certain nights, and for decades, no one dared remove it, until a new priest arrived in 1732 and demanded the relic be dismantled. Days later, he fell from the bell tower and snapped his neck on the cobblestone. Whether you believe these stories or not, what's undeniable is the psychological imprint these cages left behind. The presence of such decay, displayed so casually, altered how people thought about life and death. The lines blurred. Was death a punishment? A performance? A punishment for the living to witness? Even when the cages were removed, the memory remained. In many towns, older generations still spoke of the iron men who watched over the streets. Children dared each other to find bolts in the stone where cages once hung. And in a few rare cases, the actual cages were taken down, cleaned, and displayed in museums. Yes, museums. Because eventually, society did what it always does. It repackaged horror as history. In Vienna, a restored cage sits behind glass. Tourists stare in morbid fascination. In the Netherlands, a museum proudly displays a medieval gibbet, its twisted form barely containing the memory of what it once held. It's treated like any other artifact, a relic, a curiosity. But for those who understand, it's more than just rusted metal. It's a coffin without rest. And this shift, from tool of torture to museum piece, raises a disturbing question. Did we learn anything at all? In the next part, we journey into the religious justifications behind the coffin torture and how faith was twisted into a weapon of public torment. To modern minds, it's unfathomable that faith, the very thing meant to comfort, redeem, and uplift, was once used to justify rotting people alive in public cages. And yet, in the medieval and early modern world, religion wasn't just a part of life. It was the law, the court, and the executioner. The coffin torture, grotesque as it was, often bore the blessing of the church. In deeply religious regions of Europe, punishment wasn't just a legal act, it was a divine reckoning. Suffering was viewed as redemptive. Pain was proof of penance. And to die slowly, under the eyes of God and the judgment of the community, was believed to purge the soul of its wickedness. Priests were sometimes present during the sentencing. They didn't object. They prayed. Some even read scripture as the condemned were shackled into the iron shell. Psalms mingled with screams. The clinking of chains echoed with Ave Marias. The slow, visible decay of the human form was not seen as excessive. It was holy theater. And it wasn't limited to criminals. During periods of religious hysteria, the iron cage was turned against those seen as enemies of the faith. Heretics, blasphemers, alleged witches, anyone who questioned the holy order. To challenge Scripture was to challenge the will of God, and the punishment had to be as eternal as the sin. Take the case of Brother Elias, a former monk who began preaching a personal gospel in 15th century France. He believed the church had grown corrupt, and he urged people to seek God directly. For this, he was condemned not just to die, but to linger. The bishop who sentenced him declared, "Let the people see his body decay, as his words decayed our holy order." Elias was caged in the center of town. His congregation, many of whom were children, were forced to walk past him each day. Over time, birds stripped his face to the bone. Rain turned his garments to sludge. His eyes collapsed inward. The body remained for 9 months before it finally fell apart. The town never recovered. Even years later, merchants reported people avoiding that part of the square, claiming it still smelled like betrayal. In some cases, public sermons were delivered in front of the cages. Imagine that, the priest preaching about salvation, while behind him, a man rotted alive, his teeth exposed in a permanent rictus of agony. Faith was no longer salvation. It was a weapon of submission. But not everyone in the clergy agreed. By the late 17th century, a theological rift had begun to form. Some religious leaders, particularly in Protestant regions, began to denounce the practice. They saw it as barbaric, a desecration of both the body and the spirit. A few even referred to it as mockery and metal. But these voices were few and mostly ignored. Because while theology debated, the public still watched. And that's the most terrifying part of all. People accepted it. They passed the cages on their way to church. They bought bread beside them. They bowed their heads in prayer, while someone screamed in agony above them. And over time, they stopped noticing. The cages became invisible, just like sin, just like suffering. But what happens when the line between divine justice and human cruelty disappears entirely? In the next part, we uncover the disturbing role of monarchs and rulers, who used the coffin torture not as divine punishment, but as political propaganda. If religion gave the coffin torture its moral license, monarchs gave it its political purpose. Beneath the prayers and public rituals was something even more calculating: control. Because in the medieval and early modern world, nothing broadcast absolute power like a rotting body on display. Kings and queens didn't just rule by decree, they ruled by fear. And few things reminded the population of their place in the social hierarchy like the slow, public destruction of a human life. The cage wasn't just a punishment. It was a message: to challenge the crown, to question taxes, resist soldiers, or spread rebellious ideas. You didn't just risk prison. You risked becoming an exhibit of disobedience, a festering warning nailed above the city gate. One of the most infamous users of this method was King Charles IX of France, whose brutal reign during the wars of religion saw entire town squares turned into gardens of gibbets. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, dozens of Huguenot Protestants were displayed in cages across southern France. Their crimes? Refusing to convert. Their sentence? To rot publicly for weeks, while loyal Catholics were encouraged to walk the children by and pray. In the Germanic states, Prince Bishop Clemens August of Cologne used the cages as part of his campaign against moral decay. Petty criminals, homosexuals, atheists, and debtors were locked into bespoke cages designed to accentuate their shame. Some had twisted designs to contort the body in humiliating ways. Others were placed above marketplaces, so every shopper saw the price of deviance. These were not acts of rogue cruelty. They were systemic displays of dominance. Political theater in iron and flesh. But it wasn't just about punishing crime. It was about silencing opposition. Whispers of rebellion often died in the shadow of a cage. In Ireland, during the 16th century uprisings, English governors gibbeted suspected rebels along travel roads, letting them rot along the very paths the living had to take. It was a strategic placement. Let them see what treason buys. In some cities, the cages were even personalized. Engraved plaques listed not just the crime, but the prisoner's full name, family, hometown, and alleged sins. It wasn't enough to kill the man. His identity had to be erased in shame. Generations would carry that stain. And in royal courts, these spectacles were sometimes enjoyed with ghoulish curiosity. Diaries from noble observers described trips to see the cages, noting the status of decay, as if they were discussing a garden. Some kings even sent messages to foreign allies, boasting of their iron justice. But as with all power, the cage could backfire. The more grotesque the display, the more it burned itself into memory. Some victims became folk martyrs, rebels whose deaths inspired whispered songs and legends. In Scotland, the gibbeted body of a young poet named Gavin Kershaw, accused of sedition, became a rallying image. His bones, hanging over Edinburgh's gates, were said to sing when the wind passed through his ribcage. Soon, more poems were written. His story spread, and what was meant to instill fear became a symbol of resistance. This was the risk rulers took. The cage was a tool, but also a gamble. It could secure obedience or plant the seeds of something darker. Because once the people began to see through the fear, the spectacle turned from warning to weapon. In the next part, we delve into the minds of those inside the cage, those rare cases where written words, final letters, or accounts of survivors reveal what it meant to live and die inside iron. Most who entered the coffin cage left no final words. Their screams were the only testimony, their silence the only legacy. But in rare, precious cases, fragments survived, letters, notes, whispers remembered by witnesses, that offer a harrowing window into the minds of the condemned. And they reveal something that no historical document, no execution record, can fully capture: what it felt like to rot alive. One of the most chilling accounts comes from Albrecht Lienhard, a tailor from Nuremberg accused of stealing from a local magistrate in 1524. His crime? Taking 2 bolts of cloth and a pouch of coins. His sentence? Death by the cage. But before he was fastened inside, a sympathetic monk, Father Matthias, allowed him a final confession. Albrecht's words, scribbled hastily in Latin and later translated, read, "I feel the iron around me and know I am already in the grave. But the grave is kinder. It lets a man rest. Here, I shall not rest. I shall scream until the birds tear out my voice." Albrecht lasted 5 days. His corpse remained for months. But his words, smuggled out by the monk, lived on. In another case, Margareta von Brandt, a merchant's wife in Würzburg, was condemned in 1601 for alleged witchcraft. Her accuser? A jealous neighbor. Her trial lasted 2 days. Her punishment, the cage, was deemed more merciful than burning. During her ordeal, witnesses claim she sang hymns until her lips split from dryness. Her daughter, only 7, was forced to walk beneath her body each morning on the way to Mass. A letter from the town priest to the local bishop recounted her final hours. The woman stares with eyes like empty wells. She bleeds from the nose, the mouth, the ears. Her voice is a rasp, yet she still prays. I fear her soul is too strong to die. Margarita lasted 11 days. Locals said her cage swayed violently in the final hours, though the wind was still. And then there is the story of Edwin Hale, a British sailor turned pamphleteer who dared to speak out against naval corruption in 1710. He was labeled a traitor, imprisoned, and gibbeted along the Thames. But Edwin, clever and bitter, had prepared in advance. He wrote letters, smuggled them out with the help of dock workers, and even dictated verses meant to be read aloud near his cage. One read, "I rot, but not in shame. You stare at me with scornful eyes, but it is your silence that feeds the flies." Edwin became a legend among dissenters. His cage stood for nearly 2 years, and when finally removed, his skull was kept as a trophy by a naval officer, a grim reminder of what happens to those who speak too freely. But not all accounts ended in death. There are 2 documented cases of survivors. In Poland, 1587, A man named Jacob Wisniewski was mistakenly sentenced to the cage after being wrongly identified as a thief. A sympathetic guard secretly fed him water and bread through a hollow cane each night. After 3 days, a witness came forward and the sentence was overturned. Jacob was released, but he never spoke again. He lived the rest of his life in a monastery, in silence, trembling at the sight of iron tools. The other survivor was a Scottish rebel, Callum Dre, who escaped when the rope suspending his cage broke, and the crowd, shocked and momentarily unsupervised, dragged him into hiding. He lived in the Highlands for 13 years, but was eventually recaptured and hanged. His second death was faster, but far less famous. These rare stories bring humanity back to what history often reduces to statistics. Behind every cage was a life, a voice, a fear, a final breath that no one listened to, except the wind. In the next chapter, we'll trace how the coffin torture began to fade from law, and why even as the practice vanished, the memory of it would scar Europe's conscience for centuries. The iron cages did not vanish in fire or revolution. They rusted away, one by one, disappearing not in an instant, but across centuries. As Europe staggered toward modernity, the coffin torture outlived its purpose, clinging to the edges of legality until even the most brutal societies began to recoil from its spectacle. By the 18th century, winds of change were sweeping across the continent. Enlightenment philosophers were calling for rational justice, not public cruelty. Thinkers like Voltaire and Beccaria condemned the use of public torture as the mark of tyrants. The idea that punishment should correct rather than merely punish began to gain traction, especially in cities connected to international trade, where exposure to foreign ideas made cruelty seem increasingly barbaric. Still, the coffin torture didn't vanish overnight. In rural areas and lawless corners of Europe, the practice persisted. Some local lords and magistrates continued to use it, not because it was legal, but because it was feared. They held onto their cages like relics of authority, their rusted silhouettes looming over remote towns like medieval ghosts. But cracks were forming. In 1751, England witnessed one of its last official uses of the cage. A highwayman named James Maclean was gibbeted near Holloway, north of London. Thousands came to see his body rot. Vendors sold food nearby. It was a festival of death. But the spectacle drew criticism from intellectuals and clergy alike. One pamphlet titled The Rotting of Reason argued that such punishments were more fit for savages than Christians. The final turning point came not from morality, but from disease. As understanding of infection and decay grew, so did concerns about health. Hanging decomposing bodies in public areas was suddenly seen not as righteous, but as dangerous. Outbreaks of typhoid and cholera in densely populated towns were increasingly linked to the stench and seepage of exposed corpses. In 1790, France banned the use of gibbets and similar methods under revolutionary law. In England, the Gibbet Act of 1834 officially ended the display of bodies in cages. Germany and other Central European states followed suit throughout the 19th century. The cages were torn down. Some were melted for scrap. Others were buried. A few were preserved by antiquarians, displayed as curiosities in museums or private collections. And with their removal, an entire chapter of state-sponsored horror faded into uneasy silence. But the psychological scars endured. Writers of the 19th century, Poe, Shelley, Hugo, wrote of gibbeted corpses and rotting criminals as metaphors for decaying morality and broken justice. Folk songs and poems remembered the cage long after the last body had fallen. In some places, the fear of being caged like a crow became a generational saying, passed down not as fact, but as warning. The silence didn't mean forgiveness. It meant repression, because to admit the truth, that societies had once displayed the dying like trophies, was to admit that civilization had once traded human dignity for order, compassion for obedience, truth for terror. Yet even today, traces remain. A rusted ring in a castle wall, a plaque in a museum, a shadow in a town's history, and in the laws and systems we still live under, where the line between justice and spectacle sometimes still blurs. In the next part, we explore how modern parallels exist in today's justice systems, and whether we've truly left the cage behind or merely changed its shape. We like to believe the past is behind us. We walk through the ruins of medieval prisons. We stare at rusted cages behind museum glass. We shake our heads at the barbarity of it all. And yet, the need to punish publicly, to control through fear, to humiliate before executing justice, has never truly died. It has simply evolved. The coffin torture was explicit, unapologetic. It used the body as a warning sign. Today, our methods are cleaner, our language more palatable. But the motives? The spectacle? The degradation? They persist. Consider the use of solitary confinement in modern prisons, where inmates are sealed in cages of concrete and steel, deprived of light, sound, and human contact for months or years. The psychological decay mirrors the physical breakdown suffered by those in the medieval cage. Screaming becomes whisper. Whisper becomes silence. Silence becomes madness. Or the prison yards in developing nations where overcrowding turns human beings into stacked bodies, sleeping upright, denied water, sunlight, dignity. The smell of death, the crawling of insects, the silent suffering, it's all there. Not iron, but concrete. Not gibbets, but fences. And then there's public shaming. Digital cages. Today, humiliation no longer hangs above the town square. It spreads across screens. Viral videos, mugshots posted online, court appearances live-streamed for millions. The crime may be minor, the punishment temporary, but the spectacle? Eternal. Some victims never recover. Some take their own lives, rotting in public, one post at a time. In authoritarian regimes, political prisoners are paraded on television, dressed in shackles, heads bowed, forced to confess crimes they never committed. Their families are made to watch. The message is clear: submit or suffer. The cage is invisible, but no less real. Even in entertainment, echoes remain. Reality shows that celebrate humiliation. Documentaries that dissect human tragedy for consumption. We binge pain. We applaud breakdowns. We crowd around the virtual cage, forgetting that someone is inside it. Have we truly changed? Or have we simply learned to mask our cruelty in laws, screens, and euphemisms? In 2013, a town in Eastern Europe unveiled a replica medieval village as a tourist attraction. One of its main features? A full-size, functional gibbet. Visitors could step inside, pose for pictures, even close the cage behind them. Children laughed. Parents snapped photos. They called it history. But for one man, a local historian who lost a relative to political imprisonment during the Soviet era, it wasn't a game. He said, "You don't pose inside a coffin. You don't smile in the place where people screamed. Because the line between remembering and reenacting is razor thin. And when we forget the weight of suffering, we risk repeating it, one small cruelty at a time." In the next and final chapter, we return to the heart of the story, the cage, the bodies, the legacy, and we ask one final, haunting question: was justice ever the goal? Or was it always just control? Step back from the rusted bars. Strip away the blood, the screams, the rot. What remains is not just a method of execution, but a question that still haunts humanity. Why did we do this? For justice? Or for power? The coffin torture, at its core, was not about crime. It was about compliance. A mechanism to remind people where they stood in the hierarchy of church, crown, and community. It turned the human body into a billboard of authority. It took the accused and made them into a message. You will obey, you will kneel, or you will rot. It wasn't enough to kill a person. Their suffering had to be seen. Their decay needed to stain the streets. Their bones needed to hang as long as memory allowed. Because only then could fear take root. Deep, generational fear. But look closer. The man locked in the cage was often poor, often voiceless, often alone. The woman hung from the gallows was often innocent, often inconvenient, often just in the way. These weren't just punishments. They were purges, moral, political, religious. A way for those in power to clean the stage before the next act began. The cage offered no redemption. No appeal. No burial. It was a void. A place where justice ended and ritual began. And the crowd, we watched. We watched because it was normal. Because we believed what we were told. Because fear keeps order. Because sometimes, it's easier to accept the cage than question the hand that locks it. But even centuries later, we must ask, did the cage ever truly leave us? Its metal may be gone, but its shape lingers. In how we punish, in how we isolate, in how we parade pain. The urge to make examples, to display suffering as a deterrent, still simmers beneath our systems. So when we look back at the coffin torture, we're not just looking at history. We're looking at a mirror, showing us who we've been and who we still might become. If justice doesn't evolve, if empathy doesn't lead, then the cage will return. Not in iron, but in form. Not swinging over a gate, but whispering in code, in policy, in silence. And once again, we'll walk by, pretending we don't hear the screams. The coffin torture is one of history's darkest chapters, a haunting blend of punishment, performance, and power. But beyond the horror lies a deeper truth, that systems meant to protect can become instruments of cruelty, and that silence is complicity. If this story moved you, unsettled you, or opened your eyes to a forgotten past, we invite you to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Leave a comment. What shocked you most? What parallels do you see today? And if you're brave enough, watch our next episode, The Island Where the Dead Still Speak. Another journey into the chilling, the grotesque, and the buried truths of our world. Because history doesn't whisper.